The late afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. Its golden glow illuminated the faint hum of life, kids laughing in the distance, the steady clinking of a lawn sprinkler, and the occasional rumble of a passing car. For Marcus, a 17-year-old high school junior, this was supposed to be just another walk home from his after-school basketball practice. He wore his worn-out sneakers with pride, the same ones that had carried him through countless sprints and layups on the court. The sweat on his brow was fresh, his hoodie slung over one shoulder, and his mind drifted to thoughts of dinner with his mom. But the routine peace of his walk was shattered when a police cruiser rolled up beside him, its tires crunching against loose gravel on the shoulder. The officer inside leaned out, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the young teen's surprised face. "Hey, you," the man called, his voice sharp and commanding. Marcus stopped, his heart skipping a beat. He turned slowly, instinctively raising his hands to show he had nothing to hide. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice steady but tinged with unease. The officer, stocky, middle-aged, with a stiff jaw that seemed perpetually clenched, didn't smile. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," he said, his tone accusatory. He opened the cruiser door and gestured for Marcus to come closer. Confused, Marcus hesitated. "I'm just walking home from practice," he explained, pointing toward the basketball tucked under his arm. But his words only seemed to inflame the officer's impatience. "Get in the car," the man barked, his hand resting on the edge of his holster. Marcus swallowed hard. He hadn't done anything wrong, but in that moment he felt powerless to argue. Slowly, he walked toward the vehicle, sliding into the back seat as the officer's cold gaze bore down on him. The door slammed shut, locking Marcus inside. The ride was silent at first, the officer's radio crackling occasionally with dispatch chatter. Marcus stared out the window, his mind racing. Should he call his mom? Was this some kind of misunderstanding? But before he could gather his thoughts, the officer spoke, his voice laced with disdain. "Kids like you are always up to no good," he sneered, his words cutting deeper than Marcus cared to admit. Marcus stiffened but said nothing. He knew better than to argue. The car eventually pulled onto a deserted stretch of road. There were no houses, no lights, just the faint rustling of trees in the wind. The officer stopped abruptly and turned to face Marcus, his eyes hard and unforgiving. "Get out," he ordered, his voice cold and final. Marcus stared at him in disbelief. "What? Why?" "Out," the officer repeated, yanking the door open. He grabbed Marcus by the arm, dragging him from the car and shoving him onto the gravel shoulder. "Walk home from here. Maybe you'll think twice before causing trouble next time." Marcus stumbled, catching himself just before he fell. He watched in stunned silence as the cruiser sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. The distant hum of the engine faded, and Marcus found himself standing alone in the middle of nowhere, his hands clenched into fists. For a moment, all he felt was shock. But as the reality of what had just happened sank in, anger began to bubble beneath the surface. It wasn't just the humiliation of being treated like a criminal. It was the unfairness of it all, the audacity of someone in a position of power using that power to demean and discard him like he was nothing. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself. His mind raced, plotting his next move. He wasn't about to let this go. Not now, not ever. And what happened next would shake the officer to his core in ways he could never have imagined. This opening sets a dramatic and suspenseful tone, introducing Marcus as a sympathetic character while highlighting the tension with the officer. The unresolved question of Marcus's revenge adds intrigue, compelling viewers to stay tuned for the rest of the story. Marcus stood on the side of the road, his breath visible in the cool evening air. His fingers gripped the basketball so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The silence of the empty road pressed in around him, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the mix of anger and humiliation wouldn't let him rest. The officer's words rang in his ears like an unshakable echo. Asterisk kids, like you were always up to no good. Asterisk, what did that even mean? Was it because of his hoodie, the way he walked? Or was it just because he was black? He'd been taught to be respectful, to avoid confrontation, to always give people the benefit of the doubt. But this was different. He pulled out his phone, checking for service. One bar, not enough to call his mom. Even if he could, how would he explain this without worrying her? He imagined her face, the mixture of concern and quiet fury she'd wear, and shook his head. No, this wasn't her burden to carry. Marcus looked down the road. He had no idea where he was, but standing there wasn't going to solve anything. He slung his hoodie over his shoulder and started walking. Each step felt heavier than the last as his thoughts spiraled. This wasn't the first time Marcus had felt out of place. Growing up, he'd always been told to work twice as hard, be twice as careful, and never ever give anyone a reason to doubt him. But no matter how hard he tried, it felt like some people had already made up their minds. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And tonight had been the breaking point. As he walked, Marcus's mind drifted to his mom. She was his rock, always encouraging him to stay on track and focus on his dreams. She worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table, and she never complained. She just wanted a better life for him. He thought about how disappointed she'd be if she found out what had happened, not in him, but in the world she'd tried so hard to protect him from. By the time Marcus reached a dimly lit intersection, his feet ached, and his frustration had only grown. The thought of the officer's smug expression as he sped off made his blood boil. But what could he do? The power imbalance felt suffocating. The officer had the badge, the authority, the system on his side. Marcus had what? He paused at the corner, noticing an older man sitting on a bench outside a small convenience store. The man looked up as Marcus approached, his eyes narrowing slightly before he gave a small nod. Marcus hesitated, then returned the nod. "Everything okay, son?" the man asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Marcus considered brushing him off, but something in the man's tone made him stop. "Not really," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The man gestured for Marcus to sit. "Talk if you want, or don't. Sometimes just saying it out loud helps." Marcus hesitated again, then sat down. The bench creaked under their combined weight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet buzz of a nearby streetlight filled the silence. Finally, Marcus spoke. "A cop pulled me over. Well, not pulled me over, but stopped me while I was walking. Said I looked like someone he was looking for. Then he just left me in the middle of nowhere." The man let out a long breath, shaking his head. "Figured it was something like that. You've got the look of someone who's been wronged." Marcus frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you're carrying the weight of something you shouldn't have to. I've been there, more times than I care to count." Marcus glanced at him, taking in the lines on his weathered face and the tired look in his eyes. "What did you do?" The man chuckled dryly. "Depends on the day. Sometimes I fought back. Other times I let it slide. But one thing I learned, you can't let people like that define you. They'll try, but it's up to you to prove them wrong." Marcus nodded slowly. The man's words resonated, but they didn't erase the burning anger in his chest. As they sat in silence, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, relieved to see a message from his friend Jay. "Yo, where you at? Practice ended an hour ago." Marcus quickly typed back, *long story. Got dropped off far from home. Trying to figure it out *. Jay's response was almost immediate. "Want me to come get you *. Marcus hesitated, then typed, "nah, I'm good, just needed to vent. Talk later *. He put his phone away, standing up from the bench. "Thanks for listening," he said to the man. The man nodded. "Keep your head up, kid. The world's gonna throw a lot at you, but you've got more strength than you know." As Marcus walked away, he felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude for the man's kindness, anger at the injustice he faced, and a simmering determination to do something about it. The rest of the walk home was uneventful but gave Marcus plenty of time to think. By the time he reached his neighborhood, the streetlights were flickering on, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. He spotted his mom's car in the driveway and felt a pang of guilt. She'd probably been worried sick. When he walked through the door, she was waiting for him in the kitchen, her arms crossed and a concerned look on her face. "Marcus, where have you been? I was about to call the police." The irony of her words wasn't lost on him. He set his. He hesitated, unsure how much to tell her. Finally, he said, "A cop stopped me on my way home. Said I looked like someone he was looking for. Then he just left me out in the middle of nowhere." Her expression shifted from worry to anger. "What? Are you serious?" "Yeah," he said quietly. She shook her head, her voice trembling. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. This is why I tell you to be careful." "I was careful, Ma. I didn't do anything wrong." "I know," she said, her voice softening. "I know you didn't." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the evening pressing down on both of them. Finally, she said, "We'll figure this out, Marcus. I promise." But Marcus wasn't so sure. As he went to his room and lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind churned with thoughts of the officer. The man had treated him like he was less than human, like his existence didn't matter. Marcus knew he couldn't let it go. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't let this define him. And as he drifted off to sleep, his thoughts turned to the officer, the man who thought he could get away with it. Little did the officer know, Marcus wasn't someone who would just let things slide. The seeds of a plan were already forming, and Marcus was determined to make sure the officer learned a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. This segment builds on Marcus's emotional state, provides more background on his character and his relationship with his mom, and deepens the conflict without resolving it. The suspense is maintained, leaving viewers eager to see how Marcus will confront the injustice he faced. The next morning, Marcus woke to the sound of his mom moving around in the kitchen. He lay in bed for a moment, the events of the previous night rushing back like a flood. The humiliation, the anger, the helplessness, it all churned inside him, mixing with a newfound determination that felt like a burning ember in his chest. He wasn't sure what he was going to do yet, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't just let this go. When he finally got up, the smell of breakfast greeted him, but so did the worried look on his mom's face. She glanced at him as he entered the kitchen, her brow furrowed. "Morning," she said, handing him a plate of eggs and toast. "Morning," he replied, sitting down at the table. She watched him carefully, her eyes searching his face. "You okay?" Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. "Yeah, just tired." She sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly together. "Marcus, I've been thinking. What happened last night? It's not right. We need to report it." Marcus stopped mid-bite and set his fork down. "Report it to who, May? The police? You think they're gonna do anything about one of their own?" She sighed, clearly torn. "Maybe not, but we can't just stay quiet. People need to know what happened." Marcus leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "And then what? He denies it. They cover for him, and nothing changes. No, I'm not wasting my time on that." His mom didn't argue, but the concern in her eyes deepened. "Just promise me you'll be careful, Marcus. Whatever you're thinking, don't do anything that's gonna get you into trouble." "I won't," he said, though the ember of determination in his chest only burned brighter. Later that day, Marcus met up with Jay and a few of their friends at the park. The basketball court was their usual hangout spot, a place where they could let loose and forget about the world for a while. But today, Marcus wasn't in the mood to play. He sat on the sidelines, his basketball resting at his feet, while the others joked and dribbled around him. Jay noticed his quiet mood and walked over, spinning the ball on his finger. "Yo, what's up with you, man? You've been all weird since last night." Marcus looked up at him, his jaw tightening. "You ever been stopped by the cops for no reason?" Jay raised an eyebrow. Yeah, plenty of times." "Why?" Marcus hesitated, then told him what had happened. As he spoke, the frustration in his voice grew, and by the time he finished, Jay was shaking his head. "Man, that's messed up," Jay said, his tone serious. "What are you gonna do about it?" "I don't know yet," Marcus admitted, "but I'm not just gonna let it slide." Jay sat down next to him, lowering his voice. "You gotta be smart about this, though. If you go after a cop, it's not just him you're up against. It's the whole system." "I know," Marcus said, his mind already spinning with ideas. "That's why I'm not gonna go at him directly, but I'm gonna make sure he doesn't get away with it." Jay nodded slowly, but there was a hint of worry in his expression. "Just be careful, man. That's all I'm saying." As the day went on, Marcus started piecing together a plan. He thought about the officer's face, the way he'd sneered at him like he was less than human. He thought about the man's arrogance, his assumption that he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. That was the key, Marcus realized. The officer thought he was untouchable. Marcus spent the next few days quietly observing, gathering information. He asked around the neighborhood, subtly bringing up stories about run-ins with the police. It didn't take long to confirm what he'd suspected. The officer in question had a reputation. People called him Officer Daniels, and the stories about him ranged from petty harassment to outright abuse of power. One older neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, shook her head as she told Marcus about an incident with her grandson. "That man's got a chip on his shoulder the size of a mountain," she said. "Thinks he can treat people however he wants just because he's got a badge." The more Marcus heard, the angrier he got, but he also felt a strange sense of purpose. This wasn't just about what had happened to him anymore. It was about all the people who'd been on the receiving end of Officer Daniels' unchecked authority. Marcus started documenting everything. He wrote down the stories he heard, the dates and locations people mentioned, even the names of anyone willing to share them. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do with the information yet, but he knew it was important to have it all in one place. One night, he sat at his desk, staring at the pages of notes he'd accumulated. The ember in his chest had grown into a full-blown fire, but it was tempered by the weight of the task ahead. This wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but it had to be done. As he sat there, his phone buzzed with a message from Jay. Asterisk, "Still thinking about that cop, asterisk." Marcus replied, Asterisk, "Yeah, I've got a plan, just need more time." Asterisk. Jay's response was immediate. Asterisk, "Don't go it alone, man. You need backup, I'm here." Asterisk. Marcus smiled faintly, grateful for the support. Asterisk, "He'll let you know. Thanks." Asterisk. The days turned into weeks as Marcus quietly worked on his plan. He started paying attention to Officer Daniels' patrol routes, noting the places he frequented and the times he was most likely to be there. He even managed to snap a few pictures of the officer during his shifts, careful to keep his distance. But Marcus knew he couldn't rely on observation alone. If he wanted to expose Officer Daniels for who he really was, he needed hard evidence, and that meant finding a way to catch him in the act. The suspense of his plan kept Marcus focused, but it also weighed on him. Every time he saw a police car drive by, his heart raced, and he couldn't help but wonder if he was being watched. The tension was constant, but it only fueled his determination. He didn't share the full details of his plan with anyone, not even Jay. The less people knew, the safer they'd be. But Marcus knew he was walking a fine line, and one wrong move could bring everything crashing down. As the pieces of his plan began to fall into place, Marcus found himself standing at a crossroads. He knew what he was about to do would change everything, but he also knew he couldn't back down now. And so, with the fire of determination burning brighter than ever, Marcus prepared to take the next step. Little did Officer Daniels know, the kid he'd left on the side of the road wasn't just another victim. Marcus was about to show him that actions have consequences, and this time, the consequences would hit harder than he ever expected. This section dives deeper into Marcus's conflict, expanding on the emotional and social weight of his experience, while introducing subplots like his relationship with Jay and the community's shared struggles. The tension remains high as Marcus moves closer to confronting the officer, keeping viewers engaged and eager to see how the story unfolds. The air was thick with tension as Marcus stood on the corner, the dim glow of a streetlight casting long shadows around him. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing like a drum in his ears. Tonight was the night. Every step, every decision he'd made over the past few weeks had led him here. He gripped his phone tightly, its camera app open and ready. Over the past weeks, he'd studied Officer Daniels' patterns with a precision he didn't know he had. Daniels had a tendency to linger near certain spots in the neighborhood, always the same convenience store, the same alleyways, always late at night. Marcus suspected those weren't random choices. The officer seemed to target the most vulnerable, the people least likely to push back. Marcus had stayed up late many nights, watching from the shadows, quietly documenting the officer's behavior. And each time he saw Daniels stop someone, usually a young black man, his anger grew. He captured grainy videos and taken notes, but it wasn't enough. He needed something undeniable, something that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. The street was quiet except for the faint hum of a car engine in the distance. Marcus checked the time on his phone. If Daniels stuck to his usual pattern, he'd show up any minute now. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for everyone Daniels had wronged, everyone who had felt powerless in the face of injustice. A car turned the corner, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Marcus recognized a familiar shape of the patrol vehicle instantly. His pulse quickened as the car slowed, creeping along the street as Daniels scanned the area. Marcus ducked into the shadows, staying low and out of sight. The patrol car came to a stop near the convenience store. Daniels stepped out, his movements deliberate and confident. He didn't see Marcus, hidden behind a parked car across the street. Marcus activated the video recording on his phone, his hands trembling slightly. Daniels leaned against the hood of his car, his eyes scanning the street like a predator searching for prey. A few minutes passed, and then Marcus saw what he'd been expecting. A young man walking down the sidewalk, his hood pulled up against the chill of the night. Daniels straightened, stepping into the man's path. The interaction played out like a script Marcus had seen before. Daniels stopped the young man, his voice low but firm. The man looked confused, holding up his hands in a gesture of compliance. Marcus couldn't hear every word, but he didn't need to. He could see Daniels' body language, the way he leaned in close, using his size and authority to intimidate. Marcus inched closer, careful to stay out of sight. His phone's camera zoomed in, capturing every detail. The young man looked scared, his eyes darting nervously as Daniels patted him down. Marcus clenched his jaw, his frustration boiling over. But then something unexpected happened. The young man said something that seemed to catch Daniels off guard. Daniels stiffened, his posture shifting. He grabbed the man's arm, his grip rough, and Marcus's stomach churned. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. Marcus stepped out from his hiding spot, keeping his phone steady as he recorded. His heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed to capture everything. Daniels glanced up, his eyes narrowing as he noticed Marcus. "Hey, what are you doing?" he barked, his voice sharp. Marcus didn't answer. He kept his phone trained on the officer, his hands steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. "I said, what are you doing?" Daniels demanded, letting go of the young man and taking a step toward Marcus. The young man used the distraction to back away, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. Marcus didn't move, his focus locked on Daniels. "Put the phone away," Daniels ordered, his tone laced with anger. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady but defiant. "Just recording. Making sure everyone knows what's really going on." Daniels' face darkened, his jaw tightening. He took another step toward Marcus, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "You're interfering with police business. Put the phone down now." Marcus held his ground. "I'm not interfering. I'm just recording." That's not against the law, is it? The tension between them crackled like electricity. For a moment, it felt like time stood still. Daniel's hand twitched near his holster, but he didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he took a step back, his eyes narrowing as he studied Marcus. "You think you're smart, huh?" Daniel said, his voice low and menacing. Marcus didn't respond. He kept recording, his resolve unwavering. This was the moment he'd been preparing for, the moment he could expose the truth. Daniels glared at him for a long, tense moment, then turned and got back into his patrol car. The engine roared to life, and the car sped off into the night, leaving Marcus standing in the street with his phone still recording. Marcus let out a shaky breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The young man he defended approached him cautiously, his expression a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thanks, man," he said quietly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like someone who had just stepped onto a battlefield, knowing the fight was far from over. As the night wore on, Marcus reviewed the footage he'd captured. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Enough to show the world what kind of man Officer Daniels really was. But as Marcus stared at the video, a new question gnawed at the edge of his mind. What would happen next? Daniels wasn't the type to let this slide. Marcus had taken the first step, but he knew the real battle was just beginning. The ember of determination in his chest burned brighter than ever, but so did the weight of the risks he was taking. Marcus didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't stop until justice was served. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the night's events were just the beginning of something bigger. As he walked home, his phone still gripped tightly in his hand, he replayed the footage over and over. It was good, but something about it didn't sit right with him. The way Daniels had backed off so suddenly, the look in his eyes, it wasn't fear. It was something else. Marcus couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it left a knot in his stomach that only grew as the hours passed. By the next morning, the video had already been uploaded to a few community-focused social media pages. Marcus had been careful not to post it himself, not wanting his name directly tied to it just yet. Within hours, the post began to gain traction. Comments flooded in, with people sharing similar stories about Officer Daniels and his behavior. But it wasn't all support. Mixed in with the voices of outrage were comments warning Marcus to be careful, to stay out of trouble. Some even suggested that Daniels might come after him if he felt threatened. Marcus tried to brush it off, telling himself he'd done the right thing. Still, the knot in his stomach tightened. That evening, as Marcus sat at his desk scrolling through the comments, his phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, his heartbeat quickening. "Hello," he said cautiously. A gruff voice responded, one he recognized instantly. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Marcus froze, his grip tightening on the phone. It was Daniels. "You don't know who you're messing with, kid," Daniels continued, his tone low and threatening. "You think that little video is gonna make a difference. All it's gonna do is make your life a whole lot harder." Marcus swallowed hard, his mind racing. He didn't respond, refusing to give Daniels the satisfaction. "I know where you live," Daniels added, his voice cold. "You better think real hard about what you're doing. This can all go away if you just stay quiet." The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at his phone in disbelief. The ember of determination in his chest flared into a wildfire. Daniel's call had confirmed what Marcus already knew. He was scared, and scared people made mistakes. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He stayed up researching, his laptop glowing in the dark room. If Daniels thought a phone call could intimidate him, he was wrong. Marcus was more determined than ever to expose the officer for who he really was. But he also realized he needed help. The next day, Marcus met up with Jay at their usual spot in the park. He told him about the call, and Jay's expression darkened. "That's serious, man," Jay said, lowering his voice. "If he's threatening you, that means he's desperate. But it also means you gotta be careful. This guy's dangerous. I know, Marcus said, his jaw set. That's why I need your help. I can't do this alone anymore. Jay nodded, his loyalty unwavering. Whatever you need, I'm in. But we gotta be smart about this. We're not just dealing with one guy, we're dealing with a whole system that's protecting him. Together, they started brainstorming, coming up with a plan to escalate the pressure on Daniels. They decided to reach out to a local activist group that had been vocal about police accountability in their community. Marcus shared the video and the stories he collected, hoping it would be enough to get their attention. Within days, the group responded. They were outraged by what they saw and eager to help. They organized a community meeting, inviting people to come forward and share their experiences with Officer Daniels. The meeting was held in a small church basement, the room packed with people from all walks of life. Marcus sat in the back, listening as one person after another stood up to share their story. The pattern was undeniable. Daniels had been abusing his power for years, targeting the most vulnerable members of the community. But as the meeting went on, Marcus noticed something strange. A man sitting near the front kept glancing around nervously, his foot tapping anxiously against the floor. Marcus couldn't place him, but there was something familiar about his face. After the meeting ended, the man approached Marcus, his expression tense. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly, his eyes darting around the room. Marcus hesitated but nodded, leading the man outside where they could speak privately. "My name's Terrence," the man said, his voice low. "I used to work with Daniels. I was his partner for a while." Marcus's eyes widened. "Why are you telling me this?" Terrence looked down, his shoulders slumping. "Because I know what he's capable of, and I know you're in over your head." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked, his voice sharp. Terrence sighed, running a hand over his face. "Daniels isn't just some rogue cop. He's got connections, people who'll cover for him no matter what. You think you're going after one man, but you're going up against an entire system, and they'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves." The weight of Terrence's words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He'd known this fight wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't fully grasped the scope of what he was up against. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus repeated, his voice tinged with suspicion. Terrence met his gaze, his expression earnest. "Because I've seen what he's done. I've seen the way he destroys people's lives. And I can't be part of it anymore. I want to help you, but you need to understand, this is bigger than you think." Marcus nodded slowly, his mind racing. The stakes had just been raised, and the road ahead was more dangerous than ever. But with Terrence's help, Marcus knew he had a chance to uncover the truth and bring Daniels to justice. As they parted ways, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The fire in his chest burned brighter than ever, fueled by a mix of determination and fear. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Marcus, Jay, and Terrence worked tirelessly, piecing together every bit of evidence they could find. Terrence's insider knowledge proved invaluable, giving Marcus a glimpse into the hidden mechanisms that shielded officers like Daniels. They compiled reports, testimonies, and Marcus's damning video into a comprehensive file, one that painted a clear picture of corruption and abuse. The activist group arranged a press conference, drawing local media attention to the case. Marcus stood at the edge of the crowd, his hood up, watching as community leaders spoke passionately about the need for accountability. When his video was played on the screen, gasps rippled through the audience. Marcus felt a mix of pride and nervousness. The truth was out there now, but so was his role in exposing it. The fallout was immediate. Daniels was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. For a moment, it felt like a victory, but Marcus couldn't shake the nagging feeling that it wasn't over. Daniels wasn't the type to go down quietly, and his network of allies wouldn't let him fall without a fight. Late one night, Marcus received a frantic call from Terrence. "They're coming after you," Terrence said, his voice filled with urgency. I overheard something at the station. Daniels knows you're the one who filmed him. He's not going to let this slide. Marcus's blood ran cold. What do you mean? What's he planning? I don't know exactly, Terence replied. But he's desperate. Be careful. Before Marcus could respond, the line went dead. He stared at his phone, his heart pounding. He knew Daniels would retaliate, but the thought of it actually happening sent a chill down his spine. The next day, Marcus noticed a car parked outside his house, its windows tinted. It didn't move for hours, and the longer it stayed, the more his anxiety grew. That night, as he walked home from Jay's place, he felt someone following him. He quickened his pace, his palms sweating. When he turned the corner, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Daniels. His face was twisted with anger, his eyes burning with a mix of hatred and desperation. "You think you can ruin my life?" Daniels snarled, stepping closer. Marcus stood his ground, his fear giving way to defiance. "I didn't ruin anything. You did this to yourself." Daniels lunged, grabbing Marcus by the collar. "You have no idea what you started," he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty street. Before Marcus could respond, a voice rang out behind them. "Let him go, Daniels." Marcus turned to see Terence standing a few feet away, his gun drawn. His hands were steady, his expression resolute. Daniels hesitated, his grip on Marcus loosening. "You're making a mistake," Daniels said, his voice low and menacing. "No," Terence replied. "The only mistake was letting you get away with this for so long." For a moment, the three of them stood frozen, the tension crackling like a live wire. Then, Daniels let go of Marcus and took a step back, his hands raised. "This isn't over," Daniels said, his voice dripping with venom. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Marcus's knees felt weak, but he forced himself to stay upright. "Thank you," he said, his voice shaky. Terence nodded, lowering his gun. "You're not alone in this," he said. "Remember that." The confrontation marked a turning point. Daniel's actions had only strengthened the case against him, and with Terence's testimony added to the file, the investigation gained momentum. Within weeks, Daniels was arrested on charges of misconduct and abuse of power. The community felt a sense of relief, but Marcus couldn't shake the lingering tension. As he scrolled through the news one night, a headline caught his eye. **** whistleblower officer linked to broader corruption probe. His heart sank as he read the article. Terence had been arrested, accused of covering up misconduct during his time as Daniels' partner. Marcus's mind raced. He knew Terence had made mistakes in the past, but he also knew the man he had become, the man who had risked everything to help expose the truth. Marcus couldn't let him take the fall. The final twist came when Marcus found a hidden folder on Terence's flash drive. It contained detailed records of Daniels' activities, but also implicated several high-ranking officials who had enabled his behavior. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Armed with this new evidence, Marcus made the decision to go public again, this time targeting not just Daniels, but the entire system that had protected him. The backlash was immediate, but so was the support. People rallied behind Marcus, demanding accountability at every level. In the end, the fight for justice wasn't about one man or one case. It was about a community coming together to demand change, to hold those in power accountable. And while the journey had been fraught with danger and uncertainty, Marcus knew it had been worth it. As he stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd that had gathered to support the cause, Marcus felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like they were truly making progress. As Marcus stood on the steps of City Hall, looking out at the sea of faces before him, he felt a deep, overwhelming sense of purpose. The crowd wasn't just there for him. They were there for the countless voices that had been silenced, for the stories of pain and resilience that had gone unheard for far too long. People held signs that read "Justice for all" and "Accountability now." The energy in the air was electric, a mix of anger, hope, and determination. Marcus took a deep breath and began to speak. His voice was steady but filled with emotion as he recounted everything that had led to this moment. He spoke about the night Daniels had crossed the line, the fear and anger that had driven him to fight back, and the allies he had gained along the way. He didn't shy away from the risks he had taken or the sacrifices others had made. He also made it clear that while they had achieved a major victory, the fight was far from over. When he finished, the crowd erupted into cheers. For the first time, Marcus felt like his voice truly mattered. He had started as one person standing up to injustice, but now he was part of a movement, and that movement was unstoppable. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of their efforts became more apparent. Daniels remained behind bars, facing an extensive list of charges that grew as more evidence came to light. The officers and officials who had enabled his behavior were also being investigated, and a few had already resigned or been suspended. For many in the community, it felt like a long overdue reckoning. Terence's case was more complicated. While his past mistakes couldn't be ignored, Marcus refused to let him become a scapegoat. With the help of the activist group and a pro bono lawyer, they worked tirelessly to highlight Terence's cooperation in exposing Daniels and the larger corruption network. It was an uphill battle, but it became clear that Terence's willingness to come forward had been a turning point in the fight for justice. After months of legal proceedings, Terence received a reduced sentence, allowing him to avoid jail time in exchange for continued cooperation. When Marcus visited him after the sentencing, Terence looked tired but relieved. "You did good, kid," Terence said, a faint smile crossing his face. "I didn't think I'd ever see someone stand up to them the way you did." Marcus shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. None of this would have been possible without everyone who came together." Terence nodded, his expression growing serious. "I will," Marcus said, meaning every word. Life slowly began to return to normal, but Marcus knew he couldn't just walk away from everything he had learned. He started working with the activist group on a more permanent basis, helping them organize workshops and campaigns to educate the community about their rights and how to hold those in power accountable. He also began mentoring younger kids in the neighborhood, hoping to inspire them to believe in their own ability to make a difference. Jay, always the practical one, suggested they create an online platform where people could share their stories and resources. Together, they launched a website that quickly became a hub for people across the country who wanted to fight for change in their own communities. The website grew faster than they had imagined, with people submitting videos, articles, and tips on how to navigate systems of power. Marcus often spent late nights responding to messages from people who had been inspired by his story. It was exhausting work, but it was also deeply fulfilling. One evening, as Marcus was walking home, he passed the spot where Daniels had thrown him out of the car months ago. He stopped for a moment, the memory washing over him. It felt like a lifetime ago. Back then, he had been filled with so much anger and uncertainty. Now, standing in that same spot, he felt a sense of closure. Marcus knew the scars from that night would always be with him, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they had become a reminder of his strength, of what he was capable of when he refused to back down. A few days later, Marcus received an email that left him speechless. It was from a journalist at a national news outlet, asking if they could feature his story as part of a larger piece on grassroots movements driving change. Marcus hesitated at first, unsure if he wanted that level of attention, but after talking it over with Jay and the activist group, he decided to go for it. The article was published a few weeks later, and it went viral almost immediately. Marcus's story resonated with people from all walks of life, and the attention brought even more resources and support to their cause. Despite the newfound recognition, Marcus remained grounded. He didn't see himself as a hero or a savior, just a kid who had refused to stay silent. He often reminded people that the fight for justice wasn't about any one person. It was about all of them, standing together and refusing to back down. As the seasons changed and the city began to heal, Marcus felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The journey had been grueling, filled with moments of fear and doubt, but it had also shown him the power of resilience and community. One evening, as Marcus sat on the front steps of his house, watching the sun set over the city, Jay joined him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while before Jay spoke. "You ever think about what's next?" Jay asked, glancing over at Marcus. "All the time," Marcus replied with a small smile. "But for now, I think we just keep doing what we're doing, one step at a time." Jay nodded, a grin spreading across his face. "Sounds like a plan." As the first stars began to appear in the sky, Marcus felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The road ahead would undoubtedly be filled with new challenges, but he was ready to face them. He had learned that change wasn't something that happened overnight. It was something you fought for, day by day, with every ounce of strength you had. And in that moment, sitting under the vast expanse of the night sky, Marcus knew one thing for certain: no matter how hard the fight got, he wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever.